the public hanging of Nazi camp commandant Alexander Piorkowski. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. On a cold morning in October 1948, long after the war in Europe had officially ended, justice arrived at a quiet prison in southern Germany. There were no marching armies, no air raid sirens, no declarations of victory. Instead, there was silence, and a single man walking toward the consequences of power once exercised without restraint. His name was Alexander Piorkowski. For years, his authority had shaped the daily reality of thousands of lives held behind barbed wire and concrete walls. Decisions made in offices and signed on paper had determined who suffered, who endured, and who did not return. What happened that morning was not about reopening the past, but confronting it. This is not simply the story of one individual. It is a story about responsibility, about how systems enable cruelty, and about what justice looks like when the world finally decides to respond. Alexander Piorkowski was not born into notoriety. He came of age in a Germany shaped by defeat, instability, and resentment after the First World War. Like many young men searching for purpose and belonging in that environment, he gravitated toward movements that promised order, strength, and renewal. Over time, ideology became opportunity, and opportunity became authority. His rise followed a familiar pattern within the regime. Early involvement in party organizations led to advancement, and advancement brought proximity to power. By the time the Second World War began, Piorkowski had positioned himself within the upper ranks of the SS, a structure that rewarded loyalty and decisiveness above all else. In early 1940, he was appointed Commandant of Dachau. The camp already carried a grim reputation, but under Piorkowski's leadership, its function expanded and hardened. What had once been framed as detention became a system built around punishment, exploitation, and control. His authority was extensive. Orders issued from his office shaped every aspect of daily life inside the camp. Labor schedules, disciplinary measures, and cooperation with medical and administrative units all fell within his oversight. The system relied on hierarchy, but it also depended on the willingness of individuals like Piorkowski to enforce policy without hesitation. Witness accounts and later investigations revealed that he was not a distant figure removed from consequences. He was present. He approved measures that intensified suffering. He maintained an environment where harsh discipline was normalized and where fear became a tool of governance. By 1942, even internal reviews within the SS acknowledged that Piorkowski's conduct had crossed lines the organization preferred not to publicize. Allegations of corruption and excessive brutality led to his removal from command. But removal was not accountability. His actions during those years remained largely unexamined as the war continued. That changed after Germany's defeat. In the aftermath of liberation, Allied authorities began the difficult process of identifying individuals responsible for crimes committed under the regime. Dachau itself became a focal point, not only as a site of suffering, but as a source of documentation and testimony. Piorkowski was arrested and brought before a U.S. military tribunal during the Dachau trials. These proceedings were among the earliest attempts to apply legal standards to crimes that had been carried out under the cover of state authority. The evidence presented was extensive. Survivors described conditions, routines, and decisions that traced back to his command. Documents linked his signature to orders that authorized extreme measures. The narrative that emerged was not of chaos, but of structure, of a system that functioned because individuals fulfilled their roles. In his defense, Piorkowski claimed limited control. He argued that higher authorities dictated policy and that his responsibility was administrative. But this argument did not withstand scrutiny. Testimony placed him at key moments. Records demonstrated discretion exercised, not merely obedience followed. In January 1947, the tribunal reached its verdict. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. Yet even after sentencing, the meaning of justice remained under discussion. The post-war world was still defining how to respond to unprecedented wrongdoing. The execution itself would not take place immediately. Time passed, appeals were reviewed, and decisions were reaffirmed. In October 1948, Piorkowski was transferred to Landsberg prison. The location was symbolic. It was a place already marked by history, associated with the early rise of the very movement he had served. Now it would become the site where accountability was finally enforced. Unlike some executions carried out quietly, this one carried public weight. While not conducted in an open square, it was witnessed by officials and reported widely. The message was deliberate. Authority did not grant immunity, and time did not erase responsibility. On the morning of October 22nd, Piorkowski was led from his cell. Reports describe him as composed, offering no statement of reflection or regret. The procedure followed established protocol. There were no speeches, no ceremony, only formality. What made the moment significant was not spectacle, but reversal. A man who once represented absolute control within a closed system now stood powerless within another system, one built to impose limits rather than remove them. News of the execution spread quickly. For survivors and families connected to Dachau, it marked a rare instance where consequences followed documentation. Not closure, but recognition. Not healing, but acknowledgement. International observers debated the meaning of such outcomes. Some questioned whether punishment could ever correspond to the scale of harm inflicted. Others emphasized the necessity of visible accountability, particularly after years when secrecy had protected perpetrators. Piorkowski's case stood out precisely because so many others avoided judgment. He was not the most powerful figure within the regime, nor the most widely known. Yet his role demonstrated how cruelty often operates, not solely through famous leaders, but through administrators who transform policy into lived reality. The execution did not resolve the larger questions left by the war. It did not address the millions of lives disrupted or ended, but it did establish a boundary. It declared that certain actions, even when committed under authority, would not be absorbed into history without response. Today, Dachau stands as a memorial. Names are preserved, structures remain, and the record of those who administered the camp continues to be examined. Piorkowski's name appears not because he was exceptional, but because he was representative of how systems function when unchecked. His trial and execution remind us that injustice rarely depends on one individual alone. It depends on participation, silence, and the normalization of harm. The execution of Alexander Piorkowski did not undo what had already happened. No sentence could restore what was taken or fully answer the suffering endured. What it did offer was a moment of clarity. It showed that authority does not exist beyond judgment and that time does not absolve responsibility. It reminded the world that systems are built by people and that people can be held to account for the roles they choose to play. Yet his case also leaves us with an uneasy question. If one commandant was judged, how many others were not? How many lives shaped by quiet decisions were never acknowledged? History does not only ask us to remember the crimes themselves. It asks us to examine how they became possible and whether we recognize the same patterns when they appear again. Because justice is not only about punishment, it is about refusing to forget.